Hello, my name is Pradeep Krishnatre and I am going to speak to you about Communication Research Module 7. The topic of my presentation is experimental design. It is divided into 3 units. The first unit is on what is an experiment. We will here deal with some definitions of important terms that are used in it. The second unit is on type of experiments. There are several types of experiments that can be conducted. The third and the final unit of my presentation is going to be on experimental designs. So now let us start with unit 1, which is what is an experimentation. Okay, let us begin with history of experimental method. The idea of conducting experiments in social sciences such as psychology, sociology and communication comes to us from natural sciences. However, as all of us can understand, while natural sciences deal with objects such as atoms, social sciences primarily deal with human beings. Therefore, although there are some similarities between experiments in natural and social sciences, there are basic differences too. One characteristic that is common to both sciences is that experiments generally are conducted in controlled conditions such as labs. On the other hand, a basic difference between the two is that it is possible to frame laws in natural sciences such as law of thermodynamics, but it is nearly impossible to frame laws for how humans feel, think, act or behave. Having said this, we should bear in mind that by their nature and the way they look at the reality, experiments belong to the positivist thought. The credit of using the experimental method in social sciences goes to the discipline of psychology. It is said that Wilhelm M. Wundt, a psychologist, established a laboratory to conduct experiments in psychology. According to Wimmer and Dominic, the experimental method is the oldest approach to study communication. Okay, before we go any further, let us try to understand what an experiment is. In everyday speech, experiment means trying something new and observing its outcome. In research, an experiment means testing the hypothesis that one variable causes a change in another variable. The variable that causes a change in another variable is the independent variable, and the variable where the change is observed is referred to as the dependent variable. In such a research situation, the researcher manipulates the independent variable. That is, the researcher decides conditions purposively and checks its consequences. The experimental study involves the manipulation of the situation and measurement of the effect of such a manipulation. So we now know what an experiment is. Let us now try to understand why we conduct an experiment. What is the purpose of the experiment? The main purpose of the experiment is to empirically test a causal relationship between independent and dependent variables. It does so by ruling out all other plausible explanations that may bring about change in the dependent variable. Causality is what makes experiment stands out from the other research methods such as survey and content analysis. Stop. So let us now understand what an experimental design is. Design refers to plan or strategy. In the present context, it refers to systematic procedure in which the researcher decides to manipulate the independent variable and measures its impact on the dependent variable. There are several ways in which an experiment is designed, and we shall learn about them later. Let us now understand some important concepts and distinguishing characteristics of experimental research. One of the important concepts is control over other variables. In order to establish that an independent variable of interest causes changes in the dependent variable, it is necessary to ensure that no other independent variable or variables has any role in the experiment. The researcher therefore controls the other extraneous independent variable. In so doing, the researcher rules out the possibility of any plausible alternative explanation for the effect of dependent variable. Thus, control is an important characteristic of the experimental study, as it allows the researcher to establish the treatment or the independent variable as the cause of the observed change in the dependent variable. In other words, control over extraneous variables isolates the independent variable and makes it easy for the researcher to study its effect. Random assignment is the second concept. Random assignment means assigning the subjects to different groups under investigation randomly. You will recall that random means without any preconceived notions, logic or personal preference. It means completely accidental. Statistically, random assignment means each subject has an equal chance of being assigned to any of the groups. Researchers most of the time conduct experiments to compare two or more groups based on certain variables. To have the unbiased results of this comparison, the subjects in both the groups should be similar to each other on the dependent variable. To begin with, there should not be any systematic difference among the groups. For example, a researcher wanting to study the impact of the length of these sentences in a news story on the level of readers' comprehension creates two groups. One group receives with news stories written with short sentences, and the other group receives news stories with long sentences. The researcher then measures and compares the levels of comprehension of both the groups. In this case, if one of the groups of subjects is more proficient in terms of language skills, then the two groups are not equal to begin with. The results we may obtain would favor the group that is more proficient in the language, and such an arrangement would introduce systematic bias. In simple words, we cannot really conclude that the results are due to the length of the sentences. In order to rule out any alternative explanation, it is important to assign the subjects randomly to the two groups. A word of caution is necessary here. Random assignment and random selection are two different concepts. Random selection means that each subject has an equal and known chance of selection. For example, if you plan to select 10 students from a class of 30, you can do so by the lottery method. The lottery method ensures that each student has an equal and known chance of selection. Random assignment follows random selection. That is, having selected 10 students randomly, the researcher, for instance, can randomly assign students to different groups. Random assignment ensures that the two groups do not differ from each other in any systematic way. Now let's look at or examine experimental group. Experimental group is the group of subjects that receives the treatment. The effects of the treatment are tested on this group. To measure this effect, the performance of this group is compared with the control group. What is a control group? The word control is derived from the word counter roll, which means a duplicate register or account made to verify the official account. Control group is the group of subjects that does not receive the treatment in the experiment. It is an important element of the experimental study because this helps us to remove the alternative explanations of the effects of the treatment. What is a pretest? A researcher measures the dependent variable at various stages of the experiment. Pretest is the measurement of the dependent variable before the treatment. For example, a researcher wishes to study the effects of watching violent television programs on the attitude of the viewers. Before showing the TV program to the viewers, the researcher conducts a pretest of these viewers to measure their attitude, the dependent variable. What is a treatment? The word treatment has come from the discipline of medicine, where the doctor administers a medicine to the patient. In experimental research, treatment refers to the independent variable or the manipulation of the independent variable. Here, manipulation means making a deliberate change. A researcher manipulates the independent variable in order to check its impact on the dependent variable. the level or strength of the treatment has direct association with the effect on the dependent variable. What is a post-test? Post-test is the measurement of the dependent variable after the treatment. Returning to the example above, the researcher again measures the attitude of the viewers after they have watched the violent television program. The difference between the pre-test and the post-test attitude scores indicates the effect of the violent television program, the treatment or the independent variable. In addition to learning about the distinguishing characteristics of experimental research, let us turn to learning about some important considerations that have to be kept in mind to conduct an experiment. Other important considerations are requirement for an experiment. The first, of course, is the purpose. There are other research designs that allow researchers to identify, describe, and predict relationships, but there is no other way to test a hypothesized causal relationship than an experimental study. In order to test this, the hypotheses of the study should clearly state the cause and effect. That is, it should identify the independent and dependent variable and the nature of causal relationship between them. It is very important to have a suitable objective or purpose to conduct an experiment. Some examples of experimental studies in communication are: first one, women will feel worse about their bodies after exposure to thin media models than after exposure to other types of images. A second example could be, pictures and text together will produce greater comprehension than text alone. A third example could be, which commercial A, B or C will create the most favorable brand image of a daily. So now we come to the end of Unit 1. In this unit, we have studied what an experiment is, the definition of an experiment, and definitions of some of the important terms and concepts that are used in an experiment. Now we will move on to the second unit, which is type of experiments.